settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away, and allow yourself to drift into the soft light of an older world. Tonight, we journey to ancient Sumer, to the sacred city of Uruk, and into the life of a goddess whose story moves between the heights of the heavens and the depths of the underworld. This is the tale of Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, the bringer of love and war, the one who walked among her people and dared to step through the 7 gates of death itself. You'll hear of her triumphs, her descent, the bargains that shaped the seasons, and the quiet acts that wove her city into a lasting harmony. Let the words come slowly, like water finding its course, and feel them carry you through the winding paths of memory, myth, and dream. In the earliest days, when the cities of Sumer still gleamed under the young sun, there was one whose presence seemed woven into the fabric of both heaven and earth. Inanna, radiant and resplendent, the Queen of Heaven. She was the daughter of the moon god Nana and his consort Ningal, yet her light seemed borrowed from no single source. It was as if the stars themselves had whispered her into being. Her eyes shimmered like pools of polished lapis. Her voice carried the warmth of dawn and the promise of rain. From her youth, the gods knew she was unlike others, for her curiosity was boundless, and her desire for greatness unshakable. She wandered the celestial gardens, asking the questions others dared not ask. She studied the sacred me, the divine laws and powers that governed all creation, memorizing their symbols as though they were verses of a secret song. Her laughter could turn still air into a dance of petals, and yet, when her temper rose, storms could churn on the horizon. She was beauty and will in equal measure, a blend of tenderness and defiance. The people of Uruk, even before they built their high walls, felt her influence. They sang her praises at dawn, leaving offerings of bread and dates upon altars, certain she walked among them unseen. For Inanna was not content to remain only in the heavens. She descended often, her feet touching the dusty streets, her fingers brushing the clay jars at the marketplace, her eyes watching the faces of mortals. She loved them for their frailty, for the brief but brilliant flame of their lives. Inanna's power grew as swiftly as the date palms ripened. She claimed dominion over love and war, fertility and destruction. The priests whispered that none could match her cunning in council nor her ferocity in battle. And yet, her heart was a garden that never closed its gates. She could love with an intensity that burned like the midday sun, and that love could turn to fury in an instant. This dual nature would one day lead her to choices that no other god or goddess would dare to make. Far beyond Uruk, word of Inanna's beauty and might spread. Kings sought her favor to bless their reigns. Warriors prayed to her for victory. Lovers called her name in moments of longing. And in the heart of the celestial realm, she plotted her path. For her ambitions did not end with the gifts she already held. She desired the full measure of power, the mysteries locked away by gods older than the first dawn. And for that, she would risk not only her life, but the balance between worlds. Inanna's ascent to unmatched authority began with a journey to her brother, the god of wisdom, Enki. He dwelled in the deep waters of the Abzu, where the currents whispered secrets older than the earth itself. Enki possessed the sacred Me tablets of destiny, each inscribed with a divine power. They governed the arts of kingship, the laws of the land, the rituals of love, the skills of war. To possess them was to hold the blueprint of civilization in one's hands. Inanna arrived at Enki's grand temple, its walls glistening with wet stone, its gates guarded by spirits of flowing water. She entered with a smile that could disarm even the most watchful eye. Enki greeted her warmly, for she was his sister, and he was fond of her wit. They drank beer brewed from the first grains of the season, their laughter echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Cup after cup was filled, and as the night deepened, Inanna's words became softer, more persuasive. Enki, loosened by drink, began to speak of the me. At first, his voice carried pride, recounting the power they held. Then, in a moment of unguarded trust, he offered them to her as gifts, one after another. Each was handed over with ceremonial weight, and each Inanna received with a look of serene gratitude. The me for truth, the me for music, the me for kingship, for weaving, for prophecy, until she had gathered more than any god had held alone. But by dawn, Enki sobered. He realized what he had done and sent his servants to retrieve the me before Inanna could leave. Yet she was already on her boat, sailing the wide river toward Uruk, the me safely stored. The creatures of the Abzu pursued her fishmen with scales of silver, great birds with eyes like polished shells, but none could overtake her swift vessel. She laughed as the current carried her home, her arms wrapped protectively around her treasure. When she arrived in Uruk, the city erupted in celebration. The priests displayed the me in the great temple of Inanna, their golden inscriptions gleaming in torchlight. From that day, Uruk became the cultural heart of Sumer, a place where music, law, and artistry flourished under Inanna's blessing. Yet her victory over Enki was only the first chapter in a far greater story, for her eyes had begun to turn toward realms far more perilous than the Abzu. In the years that followed, Inanna's reign over Uruk grew ever more radiant. She became the protector of its people, the arbiter of justice, and the embodiment of beauty itself. Yet even as she walked among her worshippers, her gaze was often fixed upon the horizon. She longed for something more, something beyond the endless cycle of festivals, wars, and harvests. That longing found its answer when she met Dumuzi, the shepherd king. Dumuzi's hands were rough from tending flocks, yet he moved with the grace of the wind through tall grass. His eyes, deep and warm, met hers without fear, unlike other kings who groveled for her favor. Dumuzi spoke to her as though she were a woman first and a goddess second. They met in the meadows outside the city, where the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and the hum of bees. Their love grew quickly, fierce and unyielding, like a vine climbing toward the sun. The songs of their union were sung for generations. Priests composed hymns comparing Inanna's body to the fertile fields, Dumuzi's embrace to the life-giving rains. Their wedding was a sacred rite, symbolizing the marriage between heaven and earth. It promised prosperity for Uruk, the flowering of crops, and the thriving of herds. Yet love, for Inanna, was never without its thorns. She cherished Dumuzi with a passion that consumed her, but her nature was restless. The more she had, the more she yearned for. And in her heart, a strange curiosity began to grow, a pull toward the Underworld, a realm ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. What lay beyond the gates of that shadowed land? What secrets did the dead keep from the living? Inanna began to dream of the Great Descent. In these visions, she stood before 7 gates, each guarded by a watchful spirit. At each gate, she was forced to surrender a piece of her adornment, her crown, her jewels, her robes, until she stood bare before the throne of her sister. She awoke from these dreams, with her heart pounding, the image of Ereshkigal's cold gaze burning in her mind. And slowly, the desire to see this realm for herself became irresistible. The decision to descend into the underworld was not made lightly. Inanna knew the journey was one from which few returned. Still, she prepared with the care of a general before war. She adorned herself in her finest garments, the crown of the steppe, the necklace of lapis beads, the breastplate of golden leaves. On her wrists she wore the 7 rings of divine power, and in her hands she carried the measuring rod and line, symbols of authority. Before departing, she went to her loyal servant Ninshubur. She told her, "If I do not return in 3 days, go to the great gods Enlil, Nanna, and Enki, and plead for my release." Ninshubur bowed her head, her face shadowed with worry, but she obeyed. Inanna set out toward the western horizon, where the sun dips into shadow. She passed the silent plains, the empty rivers, until she reached the great wall that marked the edge of the living world. Before her stood the gate to the underworld, massive and sealed, guarded by Neti, the gatekeeper. "I am Inanna, Queen of Heaven," she declared. "I have come to see my sister, Ereshkigal, Queen of the Great Below." Neti studied her with unblinking eyes before vanishing into the shadows to announce her arrival. Ereshkigal, upon hearing this, felt a chill course through her. She commanded that her sister be admitted, but according to the laws of the underworld. At each of the 7 gates, Inanna was stopped and stripped of one of her adornments. First her crown, then her necklace, then her breastplate. By the time she reached the final gate, she was naked and bowed low, her divine splendor dimmed. When she stood before Ereshkigal's throne, the Queen of the Dead rose in silence. Without a word, she fixed her gaze on Inanna and pronounced the judgment. The eyes of death were upon her. The word of wrath was spoken against her. The cry of guilt was uttered, and in that moment, Inanna fell like a withered flower. Her body hung upon a hook in the wall. In the land above, 3 days passed. The sun rose and set over Uruk, yet its queen did not return. True to her instructions, Ninshubur went first to Enlil, Lord of the Air, and begged for his help. But Enlil shook his head. "The underworld is a realm from which no one escapes," he said. Then she went to Nanna, the moon god, but he too refused. At last, Ninshubur went to Enki. Enki listened in silence, his wise eyes narrowing as he heard of Inanna's plight. Though she had once outwitted him, he bore no grudge. Instead, he shaped 2 tiny beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails. To one he gave the food of life, to the other the water of life. They were small enough to slip unnoticed through the gates of the underworld. Enki instructed them to show compassion to Ereshkigal, who was said to be in agony as she gave birth to her own grief. When they reached her throne, they echoed her cries, sharing in her pain until she was moved. In gratitude, she offered them a gift, and they asked for the lifeless body of Inanna. Ereshkigal frowned, but she kept her word. The tiny beings sprinkled the food and water of life upon Inanna. Her eyes fluttered open, breath filled her lungs, and warmth returned to her limbs. Yet her return to the world above would not be without cost. The laws of the underworld demanded that she find another to take her place. And so, even in victory, a shadow clung to her, for she knew that the choice ahead would forever change her fate. and the fate of those she loved. When Inanna rose from the realm of shadows, she did not stride forth alone. The judges of the dead drifted after her like moths made of ash. Demons with taloned fingers and dust-dry wings clung to the road. They were the Gala, merciless collectors who ensure that balances are paid. Their presence chilled the air, turned birds silent, and made wells hold their water like clenched fists. Inanna walked ahead, her face bright again, yet her heart weighed by the vow that bound her living breath to his spacket. She reached the fields where shepherds keep watch. She passed threshing floors and jars of barley stacked like miniature towers of sun. She came to courtyards where musicians tuned their harps and waited for her sign. The Gala moved in a hush around her, sniffing the air for the warm trace of fear. Inanna's gaze cut through smoke and incense as she entered the beating heart of her city. There, upon cushions of dyed wool, beneath canopies hung with silver tassels, Dumuzi sat. He was clothed high. A stillness rang through Inanna's chest. "Dumuzi," she said softly, and all the light in her voice cooled. "You sit in comfort while I return from death." The Gala leaned forward, their claws tapping the stones like slow rain. Inanna's choice stood before her, inevitable as sunset. She raised her hand, and the demons seized Dumuzi. At once he cried out, grasping at pillars, calling to friends, to the flocks, to any mercy that might answer. But the decree was spoken, and the path opened downward. Yet pity flickered in Inanna, thin but real. She did not send him to darkness without a thread of hope. "Run," she told him. "Run while there is still a seam of light." Dumuzi fled, feet scattering chaff, heart thundering like hooves against the plain. His sister, Inanna, heard his cry and opened her door. She hid him in a shrine. She veiled him with prayers. She pressed cool palms to his brow. For a breath, the Gala lost his scent, and night curled around the threshold like a shielding cirque. Dumuzi slipped from house to grove, grove to canal, canal to byre. The Gala found the print of his heel in damp clay, and came like wind with bones in it. They overturned jars and scattered grain. They questioned door spirits and cocked at lintels until hinges trembled. Dumuzi leapt a fence and vanished into reed beds, where frogs beat drums with their throats. He begged the river to cover him, and the reeds to sing of someone else. The river held him for a while, heavy with silt and compassion. The Gala are patient as stone and tireless as the tide. They sniffed along walls, crawled beneath mats, and listened for the trembling of breath. One by one, hiding places surrendered their secrecy. Dumuzi slipped through reed beds, leapt irrigation ditches, and crossed orchards where figs darkened like drops of night. He prayed to Utu, radiant judge of the sky, and his kin, begging the path be opened and the hunters delayed. Utu heard, and for a moment the thorn thickets parted, showing Ar. Dumuzi ran to the wild steppe, where only wind keeps company. There the Gala descended in a whirl of dust, their mouths like empty wells. He called to the serpent of the field, to the gazelle swift of ankle, to the friendless scorpion crouched under stone. Each creature offered a small deliverance. The serpent taught him to slip. The gazelle lent him speed. The scorpion offered the sting of warning. But fate, once invited, walks with quiet feet and never loses the road. Again Dumuzi found Inanna. "Sister," he said, "take my hand." The Gala swarmed upon the courtyard and rattled the wooden posts. Inanna stood firm, her voice like woven reed. She bargained with the law that binds gods and dust alike. If my brother must descend, let me share his burden. Let the year be broken, half for him below, half for me in darkness, that the cycles of the land may mirror our sorrow. The Gala paused, tasting the truth in her words. Inanna heard of this act, and her face softened. She could not undo the decree, yet she could fold mercy into its edge. So it was decided. For a season Dumuzi would dwell in the great below, and for a season Inanna would replace him. When he rose, flocks would leap, and fields would green. When she descended, vines would thicken with sleep, and storytellers speak in lower tones. Thus the year learned to breathe. Inanna stood upon Uruk's wall and watched the horizon accept this rhythm. Priests set calendars by the bargain. Women marked the months by jars of clarified butter and baskets of dyed wool. Shepherds tuned their flutes to the key of returning hooves. In marketplaces, people learned to wait and to welcome, to hunger a little so that the feast would widen the heart. Children were told that absence is a teacher who walks without sandals, and that reunion is water poured slowly until the cup rings. Inanna visited Inanna and placed a palm on her brow. "Sister of steady heart," she said, "you have become a hinge upon which the seasons swing. I will guard your name. I will keep the songs gentle when you are below, and bright when you rise." Inanna smiled with the calm of a candle in a still room. She asked that scribes notate the bargain carefully, so that forgetfulness would not fray it. The tablets were dried in perfect sun, and rope rings were hung where everyone could see. So the pattern of going and coming found its cadence. At the first rustle of autumn, people lowered their voices and counted the steps to the gate. At the first green of spring, they danced in shoes unafraid of dust. Inanna, walking the city at night, felt the texture of time itself smoothing beneath her hands. She had descended and returned. She had chosen and mourned. She had watched love stretch itself into a bridge no storm could break, and still she listened for small pains and small joys, the little pulses by which a great city keeps its balance. Uruk adjusted to the new turning of the seasons. Festivals welcomed the return of Dumuzi, then quieted during his absence, as if the city itself remembered to lower its voice. Inanna walked among her people, offering comfort to the grieving and fire to the timid. She taught artisans to mix new dyes, instructed scribes to mark eclipses, and guided priests to read the pulse of rivers. Yet within her, the memory of the hook and the 7 gates remained, a cool echo behind her ribs. She returned often to the Inanna temple and sat before the me, tracing their etched symbols with a contemplative finger. The powers she had gathered from Enki lived like constellations around her. With them she strengthened laws, reined in boastful kings, and gave singers new modes that could cradle sorrow without shattering it. Children learned to clap patterns that matched the footfall of stars. Old women taught recipes that soothed the weary and sharpened the mind. Masons found new ratios, though. Envoys came from distant cities to learn the weaving of prosperity. Some brought gifts of copper, others lapis in velvet sacks. Inanna received them with measured grace. She did not forget Enki's anger, nor the debt of that night's exchange. With diplomatic craft, she sent offerings to the Abzu, honeyed words and careful gratitude. And though the deep remained inscrutable, the waters of wisdom sent her small, friendly currents. Still, not all admired her rise. Storm gods bristled at her counsel, and boastful heroes whispered that love softened a warrior's hand. To answer arrogance, she donned armor and led skirmishes against the bull of confusion that trampled borders and minds. Her chariot cut arcs through unsettled lands until villages could sleep with doors unbarred. Returning, she washed the blood from her fingers with lotus water and presided over weddings the same evening. Such was Inanna, the spear and the K. At dusk, she sometimes climbed to the roof and watched the sky harden into lapis. She would speak a private hymn to the invisible seam that holds heaven and earth joined. Not all battles are against armies, she murmured. Some are against forgetting. So she asked the scribes to record not only the deeds of kings, but the names of midwives, brewers, and brick carriers. She ordered that teachers be fed well. She decreed that marketplaces must keep a shaded corner where the lonely could sit and be. Rumors swirled of a new trial on the horizon. A creature vast as regret, horned with drought, was said to paw the ground beyond the borders. Inanna listened, neither dismissing nor fearing. She had learned the mathematics of calm. When the time came, she would meet the trouble with a lowered spear and an open hand. Until then, she let Uruk grow in layered quiet. Gardens learned to climb walls, wells learned to sing, lamps learned the patience of waiting for dusk. Travelers at the gates told her of far harbors where sails looked like white birds sleeping. They spoke of mountains whose bones glittered with hidden metals, and of deserts that sounded like rain when the wind combed them just so. Inanna sent gentle embassies bearing cloth, grain, and songs, not to conquer, but to stitch distances closer. At night she dreamed of ladders between cities, each rung a shared custom, each knot a treaty of kindness. She woke smiling, and the city smiled with her. A tale rose in those years of a mountain that would not bow. Its slopes held stubborn oars, and its streams refused tribute to the lowlands. Kings dreamt of conquering it, but their troops returned with stories of echoing roars and wolves made of cloud. Inanna felt the old itch to set balance where pride had dammed the flow. She called her handmaidens, bound up her hair, and took the road north where the air thins and words travel farther. On the passes stood a guardian whose helm was studded with obsidian eyes. "Who comes?" he asked, voice like granite rolling. "Inanna," she replied. "Traveler, judge, and lover of cities." She carried no banner, only the steady certainty of her gaze. The guardian tested her with riddles of ice and ash. She answered with parables of ovens and rain. Finally, the mountain allowed her to enter its courtyards of mist. Within, she found people who feared the plain, and the plain that feared the people. Streams braided and unbraided, never reaching agreement. Inanna set up a small altar on a flat stone and invited both sides to share bread. She spoke of Dumuzi and Geshtinana, of the breathing year. She invited the mountain to exhale into the river, and the river to inhale the mountain's salt. A treaty formed, simple and practical. The first caravan descended without loss. The first barges returned with Tim. News spread that the Queen of Heaven makes high things lower and low things higher without breaking either. Craftsmen carved this saying into door lintels. Mothers whispered it to anxious children. Inanna left the mountain with quiet steps, her chariot wheels singing. She offered thanks to the winds and slipped into Uruk by moonlight. There, lamps bloomed like flowers across roofs and courtyards. She stood a while upon the threshold of her temple, listening to the city's soft sleeping. Her face She remembered the 7 gates and the price of return. She remembered the moment when mercy found a handhold. The knowledge tasted like clear water. Inanna pressed her palm to the cool bricks and felt the pulse of 1,000 households. The laugh caught under a cough. The lullaby finishing a little late. The quarrel that would become a joke tomorrow. She closed her eyes and let herself be the space in which such things could live without bruising one another. In the morning, she convened a council and taught them the craft of layered victories. Win, she said, but leave room for tomorrow's visit. Repair, but keep the marks so that gratitude has somewhere to land. The council wrote these phrases on damp clay. Merchants adjusted weights. Soldiers learned restraint. Singers learned silence. A city is not a spear, she told them. It is a loom. Let every thread feel necessary. That evening, a storm rolled in from the steppe, slow and thoughtful. Thunder spoke in a language of long pauses. Inanna walked the wall and counted the breaths between flashes. She taught the watchmen to read the sky as a ledger. This is the debt of heat. This is the payment of rain. When the downpour came, gutters filled like lyres and played a low music along the streets. Children ran with clay cups raised, catching brief rivers. Old men nodded, remembering other nights when the world F. In the quiet after, lamps resumed their modest shining. From a balcony, Inanna released a small prayer that did not ask for victory or wealth, only for steadiness, for the courage to keep making small good choices until they gathered into something worthy of remembrance. The prayer went out like a bird and returned like a homecoming. Yet even a beloved city bears threads of unease. In quiet alleys, envy curls like smoke. In courts, a wrong word can bruise for seasons. Inanna kept watch. She walked veiled among potters and porters, hearing the small fractures that widen into faults. When disputes threatened to fray the weave, she arranged contests that turned anger into play. Wrestlers met on sanded squares, poets exchanged barbs that ended in laughter, and merchants learned to count with honesty by the light of her shri. One night, a stranger arrived with a jar sealed in wax. He claimed it held a dream from a far coast. The priests brought it to Inanna, who tilted it to her ear. Inside was the hush before a storm and the clatter after. She unsealed it and let the dream breathe. A vision spilled across the floor like cool smoke. It showed a future where writing grows tall, where wheels turn beyond sight, where towers of fired brick lift prayers into calmer winds. It also showed pride widening roads toward Rui. Inanna closed the jar and placed it among the me, not as power, but as reminder. She gathered the city and told them, build with patience. Let song keep pace with brick. Let children learn the names of tools and constellations together. The crowd nodded, some in awe, some unsure. But seeds were planted. That night, she visited Dumuzi in a dream of his own. They met in a meadow of silver reeds, where neither sorrow nor triumph outweighed the other. He touched her fingertips as if returning a cup. She promised to keep the gate of seasons turning, to speak well of his name, to welcome him each year with milk and first fruits. He promised to return with dew on his sandals and stories for the hearth. When morning came, Inanna felt the city breathe with her. The ovens warmed, the courtyards yawned, days unfolded like woven mats unrolling. Inanna oversaw repairs to canals and the slow training of young scribes whose hands shook with first ink. She listened to midwives report on safe births and to farmers speak of pests with names that sounded like jokes. She sent blessings to distant sanctuaries, where her name was carved with more zeal than accuracy. She laughed and accepted the zeal. She corrected the spelling kindly. She kept the dream jar visible so that ambition would remember its paw. Still, a whisper traveled with traders. The horned creature beyond the borders, the one whose breath dries rivers and whose hoof prints cinder crops. The story thickened, gathered dates and place names, wove itself into certainty. Inanna measured her spear and oiled the axle of her chariot. She asked the armorers to make simple repairs and the bakers to set aside travel bread. She did not hurry. The city needed the lesson of calm more than the spectacle of haste. Before dawn, she climbed the temple stair and watched the stars loosen their grip on the roof of night. She named them one by one, as if greeting old companions. Lapis of the archer, Gate of the river, House of the goatfish. The sky brightened like a kiln coming to temperature. Inanna breathed slowly and let the heat of purpose settle into her limbs. She would face the creature when it emerged, not to crush it only, but to teach it the boundary between hunger and ruin. She descended as die. In the streets below, roosters braided the first light with their calls. Bakers knocked flour from their palms like gentle thunder. Somewhere, a child woke from a kind dream and forgot its shape. Inanna smiled at that forgetfulness. It meant the world was soft enough to sleep in, even as spears were being counted. Before the city fully woke, Inanna called the charioteer, who knew the language of wheels. She asked him to harness the patient donkeys whose steps remember long roads. Spears were wrapped in linen, shields rubbed with oil until they reflected thin dawn. Priests sprinkled barley and water, whispering that courage is a grain that swells when soaked. Inanna touched the temple threshold with her fingers and pressed them to her lips. She did not promise victory to the people. She promised steadine. Beyond the gardens, fields opened like looms, each furrow a stretched thread. Farmers paused and raised their hands in blessing. Children collected the echo of the wheels as if they were gathering shells. The road bent toward the dry lands where rumor fattens. Dust lifted, settled, lifted again, as if practicing a speech. Inanna's eyes traced the horizon until it offered a small confession. A line of blackbirds rose and fell in one place, as though something beneath forced their wings to keep. The creature stood among withered shrubs. It was horned, yes, and wide as a gate. But what stunned the air was its thirst. Each breath from its nostrils turned dew into salt. Each step pressed a circle of cracked music into the soil. It was not merely hungry. It was the shape hunger takes when a wish refuses to learn its own size. Inanna watched without hatred. She named it quietly so that it would know it had been seen. Naming cools, she lowered her spear point and spoke to the wind. She addressed the creature as one addresses a storm, not with insults, not with fear, but with boundaries. This field is for grain, she said. That river is for children. Your path may curve between. She offered it a distance wide enough to walk, and a pond drawn in promise. But the beast snorted and scattered the promise like chaff. It charged, hooves writing brief fires. The ground trembled in syllables, too harsh for song. Inanna planted her feet and let the weight of the spear settle into her bones. The first pass she did not strike. She stepped aside and read the speed. The second pass she touched the horn to learn its angle. On the third she called to Utu for clear sight. The sun slid a hand across her brow and the spear answered, true. The horn cracked like ice in spring. The creature reeled, confusion softening the cruelty of its eye. She could have killed it. Instead, she pressed her palm to the broken horn and breathed a ribbon of cool air into the beast's rage. Wounds opened a door. Through it, sense walked. The creature stumbled to the pond she had drawn in words. Their water appeared, thin at first, then widening. It drank until the dust on its tongue remembered rain. When it lifted its head, the plains exhaled. Inanna touched its forehead and told it the law again. Not as threat, to as home. The creature lowered its head and pawed the earth with a gentler rhythm. Birds tested the air and found it safe enough to practice afternoon songs. Inanna walked a circle around the pond, sealing it with a whisper older than brick. To her charioteer, she said that the fiercest foes often arrive as confused guests. We must learn to host what we hope to heal. He nodded and began to teach the younger drivers how to guide their teams with a song instead of a whip, a rhythm that would carry them farther with less strain. Inanna listened, pleased, knowing that even a road home can still offer new lessons. The plain remembered how to be generous. Grasses stood back up, like listeners returning to their seats. Inanna and her charioteer traced a slow circle to be certain. No hidden dryness, still gnawed at the edges. The creature, now tamed by the cool oath of water, followed at a respectful distance. It was smaller in spirit, and that made it safer. Travelers emerged from thorn shade, staring. They bowed not only to Inanna, but to the creature, as if gratitude had widened the family of things. She sent runners ahead with a message to Uruk. Do not boast of a slain monster. Speak of a thirst taught to drink. Priests read the message aloud in the marketplace. For once, gossip sat down and listened. Merchants exchanged a look that felt like relief. They understood that fewer trophies might mean fuller stalls. The bakers decided to shape loaves in the curve of a horn, not to mock, but to remember the lesson of redirected strength. On the road home, Inanna stopped at villages that had grown thin. She blessed their wells and taught children a chant that keeps buckets steady. She watched potters trace a new sign on water jars, a simple wave beneath an eye. Watch the need. Feed the need. The sign spread with the ease of a lullaby. By the time the city walls rose again, the donkey team tossed their heads as if humming. The charioteer smiled without showing teeth. That is how peace grins, he said. At Inanna, lamps already glowed golden. The me whispered like bees in a sheltered garden. Inanna washed dust from her hands and left a small offering at the shrine of unnamed helpers. She thanked the runners, the dust, the pond that kept its promise. She sat on the temple stair and let her feet learn the night again. People approached one by one. A woman with a jar of dates. A mason with a hairline crack to show her. A boy who wanted a blessing on a flute that still sounded like a reed pre. She gave time as if pouring water from an amphora with a careful wrist. Where there were quarrels, she placed a story between the opponents and let them look at it together. Where there were sorrows, she braided them with a small task so the hands would not feel useless. When the moon pulled itself over the city's shoulder, Inanna climbed to the roof. She laid out the dream jar beside her and opened it to sip the quiet. The vision inside had cooled. It showed roads like threads and cities like punny. From the roof, she could see distant fires, not raids, festivals. Dumuzi's return was near. Inanna felt the city tilt toward gladness. She prepared garlands of wool and fresh-leaved branches. She asked the singers to rehearse a hymn that begins in the chest and ends at the heel. She did not forget sorrow. She folded it under the joy like a soft mat, so that dancing would not bruise the memory of loss. She slept at last, with her hand on the jar, and woke with the dawn tracing patient gold A. At dawn she met with craftspeople and asked for pots shaped with broader mouths, so that water could breathe and not grow stagnant. She ordered that school courtyards be swept at the hour when shadows are long and forgiving. She visited the donkey yard and thanked the animals by stroking the tender place between eye and ear. The creature grazed beyond the orchard, watched by children who had already named it with a kind word. She allowed the name. Kindness trains the tongue as much of. Before sleep, she spoke a hymn that braided gratitude with vigilance. May our wells remember depth. May our markets remember shade. May our leaders remember the feeling of dust before rain. She placed the hymn under her pillow so that dreams would read it and improve their manners. In the quiet, the me hummed, a deep hive, promising that culture, tended well, can deflect 1,000 small hungers before they become one great one. The feast for Dumuzi's ascent began before the shadows had time to choose their usual corners. Women beat milk until it shone and poured it into cups lined with honey. Men hoisted baskets of early figs that smelled like new promises. Children wore wreaths of poplar leaves and learned a step that starts modestly and ends with laughter. When the first flute spoke, rooftops echoed as if the city itself had lungs. Inanna led the procession, not at the front as a conqueror, but within it as a rhythm. Dumuzi came at sunrise with dew still in his hair. He stepped into the courtyard, and the air learned his name again. Inanna met him with a smile that remembered both meadow and cavern. She touched his forehead and felt the pulse of green returning to the land. Their embrace was a treaty between warmth and patience. Priests sang the sacred marriage hymn in a tone softened by humility. Bread was broken with care, so that crumbs made small constellations on the mats. They withdrew a moment to the quiet of a garden pool. There Inanna spoke of the horned creature and the lesson of thirst. Dumuzi listened with eyes like fields after rain. He told her of the murmurings below, of roots gossiping, of stones that keep secrets by sitting very still. They laughed, then let the laughter settle. They placed their hands on the surface of the water and watched twin rings widen without crossing lines. May our powers touch like that, Inanna said. Close, respectful. Throughout Uruk, artisans displayed works shaped by the year's learning. A smith showed a plowshare that sings when pulled too fast, reminding haste to consider. A weaver presented cloth, whose border patterns change with the season. Scribes read a tablet of small laws meant for daily tempers. Do not pour hot words into cold ears. Do not move boundary stones while the owner fetches his sandals. The crowd repeated the lines until they fit easily behind the teeth. As sunset warmed the bricks, Inanna and Dumuzi sat on the stair to share a simple meal. Dates, cheese, bread baked by a widow who invited her loneliness to need. Musicians leaned their backs to pillars and played as if the notes were remembering their own childhoods. The city felt knitted, yet the dream jar at Inanna's side breathed faint warnings. Scenes of tall building and taller pride. She kept the lid near. She would not forbid ambition. She would teach it to bow at appropriate door. That night, after songs, she walked the lanes with Dumuzi. They paused to watch a potter close his kiln, to admire a scribe teaching his daughter the cleverness of curves and dots, to listen to a group of shepherds telling jokes that only sheep would laugh at. Inanna felt the weave of things hold. She promised silently to guard this heldness, to keep gates oiled, to keep stories fed, and to remind even gods that power is a kind of listening made visible. Later, lamps were lit, but conversation stayed soft. Inanna invited elders to speak of winters when bread seemed far and tempers near. They told of mistakes tenderly, as if handing a cup of hot tea. Young listeners leaned forward, learning how to store warmth against later cold. Dumuzi played a shepherd's tune that made even the proudest elbows loosen. The night folded itself around the city with the care of a mother tucking in a child who fell asleep mid-sentence. In the following days, attention turned outward again. News arrived of a city downstream, where boats argued with the current and lost. Their granaries sweated with mildew and their tempers with blame. Inanna sent gifts first, then questions, then herself. She traveled with a modest retinue and the portable patience she had cultivated on Uruk's roofs. The downstream city greeted her like a patient greets a physician who smells faintly of clay and clean water. She inspected their canals, listened to the complaints of carp, and spoke with the silent men who steer at night. She found not a curse, but a set of tired habits. Gates left half-closed from fear of theft. Silt hoarded like old grievances. Work crews chosen by kinship rather than craft. She gathered the elders in a shaded courtyard and set a bowl of clear water before them. See how the dust swims until it is given a path. She drew a channel with her finger, and the bowl answered with claret. They began again. Locks were repaired with songs to set the rhythm. Crews were mixed by skill. A boy with an honest eye was put in charge of measuring the angle of sunlight on the water at noon. Priests were asked to bless the first boat that moved without complaint. When it did, the city cheered as if a stubborn goat had learned to carry its own tether. Inanna stayed long enough to see the third success. 1 is luck. 2 is hope. 3 is a teaching that will endure. Before she left, a woman approached with a bundle wrapped in river-worn cloth. Inside lay a small tablet chipped into a perfect oval. On it, a poem about bridges. Nothing grand. A hymn to the patience of spans. Inanna read it aloud and felt the words unroll like cool rope. She asked to copy it for Eanna. The woman bowed, astonished that a goddess could love a modest craft. Inanna smiled. The foundations of cities are made of such modesties. Returning to Uruk, she found the mood tranquil. Dumuzi had visited the flocks and returned with stories of lambs who think themselves lions for one brave afternoon. Inanna wrote from a sanctuary in the north, sending a blessing that sounded like a well that never overflows, yet never fails. Inanna placed their messages with others in a niche of the temple where good words apprentice themselves. That evening she opened the dream jar again. The vision shifted. A tower now, not of brick only, but of voices. Some rising to praise, some to rival. She set the jar down and laid a palm upon it. Speak softly, she told the future within. Grow tall in kindness first. Let height arrive as a side effect of quality. The jar released a sigh like the sound ovens make when they accept dough. She slept lightly and dreamed of ladders laid flat across rivers so that even fish could learn the shape of ascent. In the morning, she walked the market and asked each stall-keeper for one sentence they would give to the future. A potter said, "Leave room on the shelf." A butcher said, "Sharpen with water, not anger." A child said, "Listen to dogs." Inanna wrote them all and smiled. Wisdom prefers small bowls. The night held steady breathing. The night held steady breathing. The night held steady breathing. Word reached Uruk of strangers from a plateau where the wind writes horizontal scriptures. They carried drums the size of doors and wore cloaks stitched with cloud shapes. Their leader asked to meet the Queen of Heaven, not to bargain for gold, but to trade methods of remembering. Inanna welcomed them in the courtyard, where pigeons walk like monks. She offered dates and salted cucumbers and a lesson first: hospitality before inquiry. The strangers showed a way of keeping time with 4 stones placed at the corners of a yard. Their shadows wrote a square hymn. Inanna watched, pleased. She answered with Uruk's art of counting breath before judgment. A judge who inhales twice listens with larger ears. They smiled at the exchange and set their drums to speaking. The rhythm summoned images of wide grass and distant lightning. Children gathered. Old men closed their eyes to listen. The city learned a new cadence for Peti. But one among the strangers asked a sharp question. How do you keep your gods from quarreling loudly over the heads of the people? Inanna considered. She said that gods, like rivers, are loudest where their beds are narrow. Widen the bed. She described festivals that give bravado a place to dance itself harmless. She spoke of quiet rooms for grief, of markets where fairness is praised with as much zeal as wealth. The stranger lowered his head as if rain had reached him. Over several days, they traded tools of spirit, a charm that teaches anger to sit, a recipe for courage brewed from bitter leaves and sweet patience, a map of constellations used by caravans who prefer to travel by stories. Inanna accepted and gave in return, never letting gift become obligation. At night, in the temple, she placed each item near the me, but not among them. Powers are jealous, but teachings are friends. Before they departed, the leader brought a final present: a shallow bowl beaten from pale copper. Pour water in this, and you will see not only your face, but the face of the weather to come. Inanna poured and saw herself ringed by soft cloud. Good. Then a line of darker wind. The plateau folk would leave, and after them a test. Not terrible, but important. She thanked them and sent them with songs. She did not hurry to prepare. She simply reminded the city how to stand with knees S. On the morning after their departure, a messenger ran from the north gate. A caravan overdue. A daughter who did not come home. A rumor of men who sell fear by the bundle. Inanna listened without letting panic borrow the room. She called for torches, though the sun was high, not to burn, to symbolize a promise. We will bring light into the twists where honesty has trouble walking. She placed her hand upon the copper bowl. The line of darker wind thickened. She nodded once, and bega. The procession formed without announcement, not armed, but alert. Weavers came with rolled cloth to bind wounds, bakers with salted loaves for courage, scribes with empty tablets to capture names, so no one would vanish twice. Inanna stepped into the light, and the city exhaled. She did not lift her spear high. She kept it level with the heart. The road opened like a sentence that had waited for the right verb. The night held steady breathing. The night held steady breathing. The northern road wound between mounds where the grass whispered of old camps. Inanna's company moved with steady breath, neither rushing nor dawdling. The torches caught the wind and bent like reeds, throwing light into gullies where shadows had learned to speak too confidently. At a bend, they met the caravan, its wagons askew, its oxen restless, its guards looking at the ground as if the dust might explain itself. A young woman stepped forward, her eyes red from wind and worry. "My sister has been taken by men who trade in fear. They set their camp near the dry stream and boast that no one dares disturb them." Inanna listened until the air between words was clear. She told the woman to rest and drink. Fear sharpens thirst faster than heat. Then she signaled for the company to follow. They found the camp as dusk bled into the hollows. Fires burned low, more smoke than flame. The men sat in a ring, their laughter brittle. Inanna entered as though she were crossing her own courtyard. Her spear was wrapped in linen, her eyes unwrapped. She greeted them not as prey, but as witnesses, and began to speak of wells and gates, of seasons that turn whether guarded or not. The men shifted, unused to a challenge without threats. Some smirked, but their smirks frayed when she recounted the law of hospitality. To hold a guest against their will is to drink brackish water when the river waits nearby. Finally, she asked where the girl was. A leader pointed to a tent with a shrug meant to hide discomfort. Inanna went inside. The girl sat on a mat, braid loosened but eyes intact. Inanna knelt and took her hand, telling her she would walk home under stars, not under Hiware. When they emerged, the company closed around them, not as an army, but as an orchard shielding from wind. Inanna spoke to the captors one last time. She did not curse them. She offered a choice to follow the law of rivers and flow toward usefulness, or to be left in their own dust until thirst made the lesson harsher. They looked away, some ashamed, some afraid of feeling ashamed. On the journey back, the girl walked beside Inanna. She spoke of her sister's songs, of the taste of bread baked just before rain. Inanna told her to keep those in her mouth until they grew strong again. At the gate, the sisters embraced, and the air in the city felt lighter, as if its walls had widened by a finger's breadth. That night, Inanna poured water into the copper bowl from the plateau folk. The clouds were scattered, the wind line thinner. She breathed and placed the bowl beside the dream jar. Both spoke quietly, telling her the city was safe for now, but to keep her sandals near the door. The me hummed like a patient hive, and the torches in the courtyard burned low without smoke. The next weeks were given to tending. Inanna visited the workshops, asking weavers to add a stripe of sky color to their cloth, potters to shape handles easier for elders to grip. She walked the gardens, advising the planting of shade trees near wells so that those drawing water might stand in comfort. She met with scribes to draft a tablet of small mercies, reminders as simple as letting the tired sit, greeting the quiet ones, sharing the second-to-last piece of bread. One morning, a merchant returned from the east with a tale of a river that had changed its path. Villages that once drank from its banks now stood thirsty, while others found their fields drowned. The cause was not flood or drought, but a stone lodged where two currents meet, a stone so vast the people could not move it. Inanna considered this and saw more than water at stake. The new course was breeding quarrels over land and fish, and whose ancestors had first drunk there. She set out with a small group engineers of the city, singers to keep the work in rhythm, and a pair of donkeys who liked the taste of foreign grasses. The journey east was warm, the wind thick with the scent of flowering reeds. They reached the place and saw the truth. The stone was not a boulder only, but part of a buried cliff revealed by time. Inanna examined its surface, tracing the veins of quartz-like lines on an aged palm. She called for tools, for levers, for ropes, but not to tear it away. Instead, she showed them how to carve a channel alongside, letting the river reclaim both paths. While the carvers worked, she sat with elders from the quarreling villages. She had them tell each other the oldest stories they knew. The stories flowed, and slowly, so did trust. When the water began to run in both beds, children cheered, and fish tested the new currents. The villages held a joint feast, each providing what the other lacked. Inanna accepted a bowl of river greens and listened to laughter skip across the banks. She told them to send a runner each year with a small jar of water from both streams poured together at the temple of Inanna, so the city could remember that solutions need not erase one side to help the other. On the return, she stopped at a shrine, half buried in silt. She cleared the entrance and left a loaf of bread and a sprig of mint for whatever spirit still listened there. The air around the shrine warmed, and a faint ripple passed through the reeds. Inanna smiled, certain the offering had been accepted. Rain came to Uruk in silver threads. The streets smelled of wet clay and sweet grain. Children floated leaves down gutters as if they were merchant ships. Inanna took this time to sit with the keepers of records, reading through old disputes and the ways they had been resolved. She marked those settled by patience, by shared labor, by the careful exchange of gifts. She underlined none solved by force, without cost. In the evenings, she met in the courtyards with musicians, encouraging them to create songs for work crews, so tasks would pass with less complaint. One night, a young harpist played a melody that reminded her of the descent, not its fear, but its clarity. She asked him to teach it to the temple singers, saying some truths are better remembered in sound than in stone. A rumor reached her then of traders from the west, bringing goods of remarkable craft cups so thin the light made them blush. Fabrics dyed in colors unseen before in Uruk. Alongside these came a whisper of their leader's arrogance, that he mocked local customs and dismissed the gods of others. Inanna resolved to meet this caravan not with offense, but with a feast. When they arrived, she welcomed them under canopies strung with fresh-cut flowers. She asked about their journey, their goods, their festivals. She examined the cups and praised the skill, felt the cloth, and admired the patience of the dye. Only then did she tell a story of a traveler who entered a city and laughed at its ways, only to find himself dependent on its wells when his own dried. The leader laughed politely, but his eyes shifted. By the next day he was sending gifts to the temple, seeking a gentler welcome. Inanna accepted without gloating. She placed the cups among the me, not as powers, but as reminders of the beauty born from care. She ordered the cloth made into garments for midwives, so that their work would be clothed in honor. The traders left with lighter voices, and the city kept both the goods and the lesson. That night, Inanna sat on the temple roof, rain still whispering on the tiles. She poured water into the copper bowl. The reflection showed calm skies for now. She touched the dream jar, and its vision was quiet, like an orchard asleep. She let herself rest, her hands folded over her heart, as if holding the city there. It was during the height of the barley harvest that a strange gift arrived, a sealed jar said to be from Enki himself. The messenger would not meet her eyes, only bowed and departed. Inanna brought the jar into the temple, unsealing it in the presence of the priests. Inside was a single smooth stone, pale as moon milk, warm to the touch. No inscription, no scent, no hum. Only the faint impression that it had been watching for a long time. She placed it on the altar, wondering. Enki's gifts were rarely simple. That night she dreamed of a path of white stones, leading into a pool so deep the stars themselves swam in it. She awoke before stepping in, her skin cool despite the heat. The next day she carried the stone to the riverbank. There she held it under water and spoke a blessing for clarity. When she lifted it, the surface shimmered briefly, and a fish leapt, silver as a blade. Villagers who saw murmured that the stone was lucky. Inanna smiled and said, "Luck is a seed, not a fruit. It must be planted in action." She left the stone at the marketplace where all could touch it. Soon quarrels there eased. Trades became more generous. Still, she wondered at Enki's purpose. Was it reconciliation or a test of her restraint? She sent a jar of Uruk's best honey to the Abzu with no message but the gift itself. The river's current seemed warmer that day. Weeks later, she visited the market and saw the pale stone worn smooth by many hands. She realized it had become part of the city's weave, not as an idol, but as a reminder that even the smallest, simplest presence can shift the tone of a place. She decided to leave it there, unguarded. True gifts do not need gates. The season turned toward cooler winds. Flocks began their slow migration, and the scent of pressed grapes drifted through the lanes. Inanna oversaw the storage of grain, ensuring the granaries were sealed with both clay and blessing. She ordered that extra loaves be baked for travelers arriving before winter. She met with the healers, asking what herbs would be scarce, and arranging their cultivation within the temple gardens. One evening, a child came to her with a broken toy, a clay ox with one wheel missing. Inanna took it in her hands, studied the crack, and said, "This is how the city feels when one part is missing." She had the toy repaired by a potter and returned it the next day. The child's smile was small but lasting. In the same week, a storm struck unexpectedly. It toppled a storehouse roof and scattered goods into the mud. Inanna organized a cleanup, but also a feast from what could be saved, turning loss into a moment of gathering. Neighbors, who had never spoken before, found themselves side by side, pulling beams from the muck, sharing bread under the same awning. By nightfall, the storehouse was rebuilt stronger than before. She saw in this the same pattern as the descent and return, the breaking that makes room for renewal. She called the council and told them to write a new law that any rebuilding must include a gift to the community beyond the owner's need. A bench for the weary, a tree for shade, a fountain for thirst. The council agreed, sensing the strength in such weaving. That night, she poured water into the copper bowl. The reflection showed clouds gathering, but not in threat, in readiness. The dream jar stirred faintly, hinting at journeys yet to be taken. Inanna rested her hands on both, feeling the pulse of the city steady and sure. She closed her eyes and let the night wrap her in the same care she had given to others. Tomorrow would bring new steps, and she would meet them with the balance she had learned in both heaven and the underworld. Winter laid its quiet hand over Uruk. Smoke curled from low chimneys, and the market's noise softened under wool and frost. Inanna moved through the streets wrapped in a cloak of deep blue, greeting vendors who warmed their hands over pots of spiced lentils. She carried with her a list, not of demands, but of visits, widows whose roofs needed patching, children whose sandals had split, scribes whose lamps burned low. She saw to each, leaving small gifts with the same care she gave blessings. At the temple, she lit lamps in front of the me, each flame a promise that knowledge must be tended even when nights are long. She met with the keepers of grain, confirming that stores would last until the first green shoots. She asked them to send extra to the poorer quarters, wrapped in reed mats so the cold would not dull the grain's sweetness. One night, snow fell rare in Uruk, and the city woke to a white hush. Inanna walked the walls, watching footprints appear and vanish in drifts. Children built figures shaped like imagined gods, draping them in scarves. She joined them briefly, crafting one with a crown of woven rushes. The laughter warmed the air more than any brazier, but in the quiet, a messenger arrived from the highlands. A bridge had collapsed under the weight of ice, cutting off a village from the winter trade. Inanna gathered a small company of builders, healers, and singers to travel at first light. She carried not only tools, but the memory of seasons when she herself had needed the help of others. The road was hard, but they reached the village, finding stores low and tempers thinner than the ice on the river. Inanna set the singers to work first, their voices carrying across the water like early sunlight. She directed the builders to fashion a temporary crossing from timber and rope, strong enough to carry food and firewood. By nightfall, the first baskets had passed into grateful hands. Inanna stayed until the bridge was rebuilt in stone, marking it with a carving of two clasped hands. She told the villagers to touch it each time they crossed, to remind them that strength comes from the space between palms as much as from the grip. When she returned to Uruk, the snow had melted, but the warmth of the journey clung to her. The city greeted her with relief, and she placed a small piece of the bridge's stone in the temple, so its story would stay. The thaw brought travelers from the south, their carts heavy with resin, bright cloth, and jars of fragrant oil. Among them came a group of storytellers whose words could make the air taste of salt or spice. Inanna welcomed them into the great courtyard, offering bread baked with herbs so their tongues would be well seasoned for tales. They spoke of distant ports, where ships wore painted eyes to see through storms, of markets, where glass was shaped like captured rain, of mountains, where fires burned inside the earth and spoke through vents in the ground. Inanna listened, her own eyes glinting like the lapis beads she wore at her throat. One storyteller spoke of a city ruled by silence. No public speech, no song, only signs made with the hands. At first, this troubled her, but as the tale unfolded, she saw the beauty in their quiet. Disputes ended quickly. Work moved like water, and the people knew each other's faces as if reading poems. She asked the storyteller to teach her the signs for peace, for water, for home. She learned them quickly, her hands shaping the air into meaning. Inanna invited the storytellers to visit the schools, where they taught children tales in both voice and sign. Laughter and gestures mingled, weaving new threads into Uruk's cloth. She arranged for the storytellers to carry back gifts, fine wool, polished carnelian, and songs written on clay so they would remember Uruk as generous ground. Later, in the temple, she signed the word for home to the me, as if to seal the story into the city's heart. She believed that even gods must sometimes learn a new language to keep their wisdom supple. That night, she poured water into the copper bowl and watched the reflection bend, as though it too were trying to speak in signs. The dream jar showed no warning, only a road curving toward the horizon, its end hidden, but its path smooth. She slept with her hands resting on her chest, fingers curved in the shape of a blessing. Spring arrived early, and the air smelled of new reeds and wet stone. Inanna oversaw the planting of barley, walking the furrows, and offering seeds from her own hand. Farmers took this as a sign of good fortune, and their songs that day carried farther than usual. One morning, a fisherman brought her a net tangled with something strange, a tablet sealed in pitch, its surface faintly marked. She took it to the temple, softening the pitch over a small flame until the marks could be read. The writing was old, older than many of the me, and spoke of a hidden spring deep in the hills beyond Uruk. The spring's water, it said, could calm storms when poured into the river at dawn. Intrigued, Inanna gathered a small group and set out to find it. The path wound through flowering orchards and over ridges where the wind combed the grass in steady lines. They found the spring in a hollow guarded by tall stones. Its water was so clear, it seemed the earth had not yet learned to cloud it. She filled a jar and blessed the spring, leaving offerings of flowers and bread. On the return, they reached the river, just as the sun lifted. She poured the water into the current, speaking the words from the tablet. The surface rippled, and the wind eased. For days afterward, the skies over Uruk were calm, and the people marveled at the sudden gentleness of the weather. Inanna placed the tablet in the temple archives, marking it with a seal, so future generations would know both its power and its origin. She reminded the priests that such gifts are not for hoarding, but for keeping in trust. The river, she said, belongs to those who will walk its banks long after we are gone. As the year ripened, a group of artisans approached Inanna with a request. They wished to build a hall where skills could be taught freely, without the binding of apprenticeships or the cost of materials. Inanna approved, seeing it as another thread in the city's weave. She offered timber from the temple stores and ordered masons to assist. The hall rose quickly, its walls open to the breeze, its roof supported by carved beams, showing scenes of work potters at their wheels, weavers at their looms, scribes bent over tablets. On the day it opened, Inanna walked through its rooms, touching each tool as if blessing it. She told the artisans that teaching is a form of building, and that each student was a brick in the city's unseen foundation. Soon the hall was full children learning to plane wood, elders showing how to twist fibers into rope, strangers trading methods of dyeing cloth. The air smelled of sawdust, ink, and warm bread from a nearby oven. Inanna visited often, sometimes to instruct, sometimes to listen. She believed that listening was itself a kind of craft. One afternoon, she found a young boy trying to carve a bird from a block of wood. His cuts were hesitant, the bird awkward. She knelt beside him and said, "The first flight is always uneven. The second learns from the first." He smiled and kept working. Weeks later, he brought her the finished carving, its wings open as if catching wind. She placed it in the temple, a reminder that skill grows in the space between attempts. Summer returned with heat that pressed the air into stillness. Inanna ordered the digging of new cisterns and the planting of shade trees along the main streets. She walked the city at midday, ensuring that water jars stood in the markets for any who needed them. One day, a runner came with news of a dispute at the border, two villages claiming the same well. Inanna traveled there. Finding the people gathered in tense circles, she asked them to sit together under the largest tree and told them a story of the two rivers she had once rejoined. The elders listened, their faces easing as they remembered that solutions can widen rather than narrow. She proposed that both villages care for the well jointly, with each sending guardians to tend it on alternating days. They agreed, and she marked the well with a carving of two hands pouring water from the same jar. She told them to drink together from time to time, so the taste would remind them of their shared right. Returning to Uruk, she saw the hall of artisans thriving, the market shaded, the gardens lush. She knew these were not the acts of a season, but the steady work of years. That night, she poured water into the copper bowl. The reflection showed a road stretching into the distance, the horizon touched with gold. The dream jar stirred, showing gates not of the underworld, but of other cities. Inanna felt the pull of travel again, knowing that the threads of her story were meant to weave beyond Uruk's walls. Inanna rose before dawn and stood at the edge of the city, where the road becomes opinion and then becomes distance. The dream jar had shown gates, not warnings, but invitations. She felt the tug to travel again, not to conquer, but to tune. She left Inanna in the care of wise hands and gathered a small company, a scribe with a careful ear, a healer who laughed easily, two guards who preferred diplomacy to bruises, and a cart whose wheels hummed songs about patience. They went east first, to a city where the river wore bracelets of reed and bronze. There, the people argued over tolls and the right to sing on public steps. Inanna asked them to show her the steps. They were smooth with history, nicked with stubbornness. She poured water from her copper bowl along the edge, letting the sun stitch light to stone. She told them that steps are for rising together, that tolls must be light enough to invite, that songs should measure a community's breath, not its vanity. She proposed a morning hour for free singing, 2, an evening hour for quiet, and an open bowl at the base for coins, to be shared between keepers and singers. The first week felt awkward, then good. The river listened and softened its elbows. Boats began to greet each other by name. Children learned harmonies that made room for shy notes. Traders who had come to haggle stayed to clap. From there she journeyed to a hill town that had forgotten laughter. Its markets were neat and tired. Its elders were respected and dull. Inanna rented a small stall and sold stories as if they were figs. 1 coin for a tale that made you think, 2 for a tale that made you laugh. People came uncertain, left lighter. She asked the potters to stamp the bottoms of cups with short jokes. She taught the judges to end minor trials with a riddle answered by both sides. Slowly the town remembered that joy oils the axles of justice. On a salt road, she met a caravan transporting mirrors from far coasts. The leader asked if she wished to buy. Inanna traded instead a lesson that mirrors polished only on one side make a nation squint. She purchased a single small circle of silvered glass and gave it to the caravan's youngest guard, with the instruction to check his own face for impatience before checking others. The guard laughed and promised to try. At a crossroads shrine, she left offerings to the spirits of choices. Bread for the hungry option, dates for the sweet risk, clear water for the path that tells the truth. The wind approved, dust rose like soft applause. Her company rested that night in a walled garden where pomegranates hung like lanterns. The scribe read notes aloud and found that his lines had begun to sound like prayers. The healer taught the guards how to bind a wound with calm words first and cloth second. News reached them of a valley where craftsmen were hoarding a new glaze, keeping its recipe tight as a fist. Inanna visited the kilns and praised the color, a blue that remembered rain without needing clouds. She asked for a bowl to be made for the temple. The guildmaster refused. She smiled and commissioned 100 bowls for the public wells instead, to be paid by the city in grain and goodwill. The young artisans, flattered by trust, shared the recipe with the baker, the weaver, the mason, and the jealous fire learned shame and softened. In the evenings, she wrote letters to Uruk. She told of steps that taught song, of markets that learned to grin, of bowls that made water happier to be held. She ended each letter with a blessing for Dumuzi's path and Inanna's patience, and a reminder that gates are most useful when they swing easily but close well. She sealed the letter with a soft vow. Southward, the road braided through orchards where wind invented new alphabets in the leaves. Inanna's company passed villages that greeted them with warm water and unpracticed songs. She asked each host for a local word that had no equal elsewhere. They collected treasures, a term for the sound of bees when rain is near, a verb for remembering someone by taste, a noun meaning the line on the horizon where courage gathers. The scribe wrote them as if setting gemstones in a careful band. They reached a harbor town whose piers creaked like old thinkers. Ships sat like patient cattle, sails tied and dreaming. The governor met Inanna with tired politeness and a list of complaints. Fishermen ignoring quotas, the tax counters with slippery fingers. Storm bells rusted into silence. She listened and asked to walk alone along the quay. There she spoke with rope and tar, with gulls and splinters. She returned with a plan that sounded like common sense, wearing fresh sandals. She decreed that fishermen would set aside the first catch each 10th day for widows and orphans, that counters would sit in sunlight where numbers blush when handled roughly, that storm bells would be polished with oil and assigned to children whose pride would keep them eager. Within a month, the harbor's breath evened. Nets came up honest and full. The gulls learned to expect less theft and more crumbs. The governor slept a night without waking to count regrets. Beyond the harbor rose a peninsula of wind. On its tip stood a lighthouse whose flame had dwindled to a sulk. Inanna climbed its stairs, speaking to each step about perseverance. At the top she found a keeper whose hands shook from years of solitary duty. She brewed him tea and taught him a song to steady the wick. She ordered that the post be shared by pairs henceforth, so that loneliness would not gnaw at duty. The flame grew strong, and ship captains saluted the light as they passed, tipping their hats to the idea of companionship. Further on, the caravan met a troupe of mask dancers who performed grief until the audience wept and were lighter after. Inanna joined them for an evening, wearing a simple veil. Her steps carried the memory of the 7 gates. The crowd felt the weight and the release without knowing why. Afterward, she gave the troop grain and new sandals, asking them to visit villages that had forgotten how to lay down sorrow. One dawn, they camped near a field of broken statuary, faces eroded into suggestions, fingers missing, but gestures intact. Inanna walked among them as in a school for humility. She straightened a toppled lion and whispered that pride should practice sitting. She asked the scribe to copy any surviving inscriptions. There was one, a short line about the danger of hurrying through sacred tasks. She kept that line near her heart for the rest of the journey. At last they turned toward Uruk, carts lighter of grain and heavier of lessons. As the city's towers grew from haze, Inanna felt a tide rise in her chest. Relief? Yes, and readiness. The dream jar had begun to breathe more quickly at night. She sensed the pattern changing, as if a loom were about to accept a bolder thread. She resolved to bring home not only gifts, but a willingness to reshape the familiar. For even beloved habits can dull the blade of purpose if never rehomed. She crossed Inanna's gate. Uruk received Inanna with the warmth of bread just pulled from the oven. Lamps lifted their small moons as she passed. Children ran ahead to announce the obvious. Priests bowed. Artisans smiled. Elders wiped their eyes as if dust had chosen an inconvenient hour. She climbed the temple stair and touched the threshold. The Mies stirred like bees, recognizing their keeper. Inanna breathed in the city's scent, clay and sesame, and the faint metal sweetness of river fog. She set about weaving travel's lessons into home. The harbor's storm bells became a pattern for school drums that called to learning. The hill town's jokes appeared beneath clay cups in the market. The lighthouse's paired duty taught the guard posts to share watches in friendly shifts. The glaze that remembered rain brightened public wells. And envy, seeing itself reflected beautifully, forgot to be cruel for a moment. Inanna visited the Hall of Artisans and asked for a new wing where mistakes could be displayed, not mocked, honored. She believed failure, properly framed, is a tutor with patient hands. The room filled quickly, a bowl too thin that folded like tired paper. A tablet scratched and smudged but brave with first thoughts. A weave whose border wandered off to meet a different story. Children loved this room best. They pointed and guessed what each attempt had hoped to be. Then they tried again. She met with judges to revise the tablet of small mercies. They added lines grown from the road. Praise the bell ringer before the storm. Let the keeper be kept by a friend. Laugh at the cup, then pour tea. Share recipes until hoarding blushes. The scribe smiled as the phrases settled neatly into clay. Priests blessed the tablet, not with thunder, but with the hum of everyday lamps. At dusk, Inanna stood on the wall and felt a hush climb with her. The dream jar and the copper bowl rested on a tray behind her, carried by the scribe. She poured water and saw a reflection braided with many streets. She opened the jar and inhaled a vision that tasted like journeys stitched to hearths. She realized the pattern. The city had become a teacher that travels without moving, a lantern whose flame learns from every guest. Yet she sensed a deeper lesson approaching. Not danger, completion. The year rounded toward the season when Dumuzi descends and returns. Inanna felt gratitude and a quiet ache. She visited the pastures to sit with shepherds and hear the new jokes of the lambs. She visited the archives to read old petitions solved by kindness. She visited the room of honored mistakes and left her own, a scrap of song she could not finish during her descent. She smiled at its stubbornness and let it be. That night, she dreamed of the 7 gates again. But they were open like windows, and Ereshkigal's hall was full of chairs. Guests sat, listening. Their faces were ordinary, not dead, not fearful, simply attentive. Inanna woke and knew the next work, to teach the tale of descent not as terror, but as craft. a method for becoming light enough to be carried back. She summoned teachers, midwives, caravan leaders, judges. She asked them to learn the steps and pass them on, to travel without leaving. They practiced releasing pride and hurry. At each imagined gate they breathed and set one small burden down. They learned to pause without fear. The city listened and began to learn. The teaching spread through Uruk like irrigation water, finding every furrow. In workshops, masters set aside an hour each week to unlearn one habit. In homes, elders told stories of the time they lay quiet until a better answer arrived. In courts, judges paused long enough for anger to run out of breath. The city's pulse slowed to something sustainable, even joyous. Inanna felt the texture of her own name changing in prayer. It rang less as plea, more as companionship. She welcomed this. A goddess who is only asked to rescue will never hear the sound of maturation. She wished to be present at the table where people learn to pour for each other, not only at the door when the jar is empty. One morning Inanna arrived, dust on her hem and light in her eyes. "Sister," she said, "the year is balanced. Dumuzi prepares for his descent with calm feet. I have written new hymns for the season. Would you walk with me to the fields?" Inanna smiled and joined her. They moved among sheaves, stacked like small houses, touching the work with careful palms. They spoke little. Words seemed unnecessary as the earth exhaled its grain. At the boundary stone where shepherd paths meet irrigation ditches, they sat and shared bread. Inanna told of dreams from the great below, not nightmares. Instructions: place a stool near every grief so that visitors can sit. Keep a cool jar ready for words too hot to hold. Mark safe paths through dark rooms with knotted cords. Inanna listened, recognizing the wisdom as what she herself had learned while hanging in silence. They laughed softly, that even sorrow writes manuals when given time. Together, they visited families who had lost and then found. A child returned, a debt forgiven, a friendship mended after long dust. They left small tokens: a reed tied with wool, a cup with a blue lip, a phrase to be hung above a door. "Expect the return." The city nodded. Expectation shifted from fear to a gentle readiness. Near sunset, they reached a shrine to Ereshkigal, modest and tidy. Inanna knelt without fear. She thanked her sister aloud, naming the strength taught by limit, the clarity gifted by stillness. A cool wind edged the air, and a black bird settled on the lintel as if to sign its agreement. Inanna placed a garland there and promised to keep the shrine supplied with fresh water and a broom. The sisters walked home in a quiet, braided from respect. That night, Inanna stood on the roof and looked toward the step. The copper bowl reflected a sky free of knots. The dream jar was warm. She did not open it. Some nights do not need visions. They need the simple stretch of confidence across the dark. She slept with that stretch around her like a shawl, and the city slept as if rocks themselves were pillows. Preparations for the rite grew gentle. Garlands were woven for endurance as much as triumph. Bakers kneaded loaves with a pinch of salt kept from tears. Singers tuned to patience. Inanna adjusted small things: the angle of a banner, the spacing of lamps. The blessings ordered so the hurting were named first, and the joyful were asked to carry extra gladness. When the procession formed, it moved like a river. Dumuzi looked once at the city, then toward the gate where absence begins. Inanna met his eyes. Meadow and hook, only practice. He descended with a calm others could keep. Again, when Dumuzi's season deepened, Uruk grew quiet in the way that makes sound travel farther. Hammers were softer, lullabies longer. Inanna moved through the hush like a lantern that does not demand the center of the room. She visited the lonely, the overbusy, the newly brave. She adjusted weights, schedules, and expectations, the way a gardener corrects a trellis so vines choose better sky. One afternoon, a delegation arrived from the mountain city, where she had once taught the treaty of river and stone. They brought news of tremors unsettling the stair streets. A wall had cracked. A cistern had sulked itself empty. Inanna went with them at once, unwilling to let old lessons crumble. The climb was steep but friendly. Goats greeted them like doorkeepers who have mastered eyebrows. The city was tense but ready. She called for open gatherings in 3 squares at once. In the first, engineers drew the mountain's bones in ash and water. In the second, elders named safe courtyards and dangerous corners. In the third, children trained as messengers, running routes between squares, so information would move like a healthy pulse. Inanna walked from circle to circle, stitching plans with visible thread. At night, a stronger trembling came. Dust curtained the moon. People poured into the courtyards, carrying blankets and the names of those they loved. Inanna stood at the center and began a slow count. A rhythm steady as a loom. The crowd matched her breath. When the shaking passed, they found themselves standing closer, calmer, more willing to listen to stone. By dawn, teams were assigned, some to shore walls with timber, some to dig new cisterns, some to cook. After 7 days, the mountain accepted the city's respectful attention and settled. A new law was carved on a public stair. Name what could fall. Prepare where you stand. Share the weight. Sing while you work. Inanna poured water from the copper bowl over the carving and left a garland that would dry into a memory. The people sent her home with baskets of cheese that tasted of stubborn flowers. On her return to Uruk, she paused at the field of broken statuary. She found that others had raised the fallen figures and tied blue cords around their wrists, not to bind, to remember. She smiled and added a cord to the lion she had earlier straightened. Its stone mouth seemed slightly kinder. Perhaps the kindness was hers. That evening she climbed the temple stair slowly, feeling each step as a syllable. The me hummed. The dream jar was quiet. The copper bowl showed a sky polished by recent winds. Inanna stood between artifacts and air and felt the arc of her days. The city was learning to keep itself. Her work was not ending. It was changing. She whispered a promise to continue walking wherever balance thinned, to carry the craft of descent as a teaching rather than a threat, and to let the future arrive without panic. She sent runners inviting nearby towns to gather at Inanna. Not a festival, a conversation. Bring your best fix for a common trouble. Bring a small, wise habit. We will trade them like seeds. The message pleased the roads. Soon courtyards filled with remedies and little arts. Uruk became a marketplace of good habits, and Inanna stood among them not as owner, but as host. She felt the underworld and the heavens agree in her chest. A balance steady enough to share. Indeed, the marketplace of good habits lingered for days. Villagers, traders, and scribes carried their seeds of wisdom back to distant corners. Some took home a new way to measure cloth. Others, a game that makes quarrels dissolve. Many simply carried the memory of Uruk's open gates, and a goddess who walked among them without a crown's distance. Inanna watched them go, her heart steady. She had been the queen of heaven, the wanderer, the judge, the lover, the descender into shadow, and the teacher returned. She knew the shapes of hunger and of enough. She had seen thirst turned into gentleness, pride into song, fear into skill. Her city breathed with her, and the me shone in quiet harmony. That evening she climbed the temple stair one last time before the season turned. She set the copper bowl in the last light of the sun, and it showed not visions of trouble or demand, but the simple, whole face of Uruk. Rooftops warm, streets easy, laughter moving like wind through grain. She opened the dream jar. Inside was only stillness, as if every journey had returned home and needed nothing more. She placed both beside her at the altar, not as burdens but as companions, and turned to look at the horizon. Somewhere beyond it, new roads would call, and when they did, she would go. Not to leave Uruk, but to bring it wherever balance was needed. For she was Inanna, queen of heaven and the underworld, the keeper of descent and return, the patient gardener of both mortal and divine hearts. And her story, though resting, would always be ready to walk again. And so the story of Inanna comes to rest. She has walked with us through golden markets and shadowed halls. She has shown that even the greatest powers must learn to listen, and that every descent can become a lesson for the return. Her city breathes on, cradled by the wisdom she planted in small mercies and shared labors. As the night deepens, let this tale be your lantern, a reminder that balance can be found between any two worlds, and that we each carry the power to make our own gates open and close with care. Sleep well, knowing that the Queen of Heaven watches not from a distance, but from within the calm you are keeping now.